Okay, hello. Today I want to talk about an AI theory of mind. This is research that my students and myself have been working on for quite some time. And the idea is basically that in computer vision and machine learning, we have solved many problems like object recognition and face recognition. And by solved, I don't mean they're completely solved, but that there's been a lot of research done on them, and there are algorithms that are able to perform quite successfully in specific tasks. However, humans and specifically other types of animals like apes are able to do much more complex tasks like the recognition of emotion, the recognition of intent, and the interest of others. And this is typically called in psychology and neuroscience theory of mind. So we just want to know how can we design computer vision and machine learning algorithms that are moving us closer to that AI theory of mind. And part of this theory of mind is recognizing emotions and the intents of others, but also explaining the why that's sometimes called mentalizing, because we create a mental video of what occurs in specific cases, and we can then simulate specific conditions from specific agents. So to begin with, I'll start with emotions and then move into intent. Specifically for emotions, researchers in general agree that human emotions correspond to the execution of a number of computations that are executed by the central nervous system. So when there is an external stimuli, we respond to that, or rather the central nervous system responds to that. And there are certain outputs that we can observe. Some of these computations or outputs sometimes correspond to facial muscle articulations on the face. And these are called action units. That is a hypothesis that goes back to the Greek philosophers. Descartes also mentioned those, but it was really made famous by Duchenne, shown here on the right, and then by Charles Darwin a few years later. So the idea is that when we want to express happiness, most likely we want to do that voluntarily, or when we want to express surprise or fear, we move specific facial muscles on the face based on some basic concepts of how our central nervous system works and our culture of what we have acquired over time. So basically what is going on is that in our brain, we have an algorithm that creates these action units to specifically determine which of those emotion categories shown on the left, or which of these psychological variables, continuous variables shown on the right of your screen, arousal and valence, for example, actually correspond. So I want to emphasize, because this is not very well known in the CVPR community, that the brain does not encode emotion categories like on the left, or continuous variables like arousal and valence on the right, but rather we have a system of action unit recognition, which is biological motion recognition in the brain, that allows us to do recognition of motion categories and continuous variables like arousal and valence. If you are curious, we have a paper back in 2016 in Journal of Neuroscience. We actually show that this area that recognizes the action units is right here behind your right ear, in an area of the brain called the posterior superior temporal sulcus. So basically what happens is that then these action units that you have here represented as axes of a multidimensional face space correspond to either an active or inactive facial action, or action unit rather. And depending on which quadrant you are here, or in more dimensions, obviously there will be an octant, right? But basically in this quadrant, in this plot, when you are in this area, because you have this action unit active and this other action unit active, then you have a specific emotion category that is associated. In our culture, for example, it's associated to happiness. And then there's this other set of action units that are active or not active that is associated to the recognition of surprised. This is very interesting, and we have known this for many years, and we've published a number of papers about this that have been verified over and over again, both in the neuroscience domain and also used in computer vision and machine learning to design very successful algorithms, as I'll show. But a few years ago, around 2014, we were wondering what happens with these quadrants of the phase space that we don't know what they correspond to, right? So like this one's empty areas here. If this quadrant corresponds to happiness and this one corresponds to surprise, what do these two represent? And the problem is that for these two, they have some action units that are active for happiness, but not all of them, and some action units that are active for surprise. So the hypothesis we had, could this be something like happily surprised because I'm expressing happiness and surprise at the same time? So we tested this in a large number of individuals in a large population in the US, and we actually found that this is actually true, that people generally perform this combination of action units to express things like happily surprised or sadly fearful. Most interestingly, as I said earlier, happily surprised has a combination of action units that comes from happiness and surprise. So for example, the action unit 12 and 25 are used here for happily surprised. Those come from happiness, and action units 1 and 2 come from the expression of surprise. Another, oh, by the way, this expressions here that are compound of two other emotions, we call them compound facial expressions of emotion, and you can read more about those in this PNAS paper in 2014. Another very interesting compound facial expression that we discovered back in 2016 is the not face, and it's a combination of contempt, anger, and disgust. So meaning that it's a quadrant or an orthon of the space that has a combination of action units that correspond to these different other categories. And this is interesting because this expression, it's used to negate sentences. It's actually used in all the languages in the world that we have tested thus far to negate, and especially, but not uniquely, strongly negate some statements. And the importance of this is that this could be a hypothesis of how the evolution, or good hypothesis how language actually evolved through the expression of emotion. So as I promised, and most interesting for this workshop, we have integrated all this knowledge into a computer vision model that we published in the EmotionNet paper in CVPR back in 2016. And then basically, we just followed all the steps of these models, these cognitive neuroscience models that I have described, and built a system that can recognize these action units and then can recognize the categories of this basic and compound emotions. And basically, this allows us to recognize very accurately the action units with a combination of methods, including kernel subclass discriminanalysis. This is a method that we developed many years ago. And these are some of the results that you can get applied to video, where you just keep tracking of the movements of these facial muscles. So action unit 1 is the raising of the inner corner of the eyebrows. Action unit 12 is the pulling of the lips. Action unit 6 is the wrinkle of the eyes because of the raising cheeks, etc. IU 25, open mouth. So you see how this works. And this system is extremely robust, extremely simple to build with a certain number of convolutions and subclasses, and you're done. So moving on to newer stuff that we have been working on, I want to spend some time actually talking about other computations that are associated to the expression and recognition of emotion from others. So as I said earlier, researchers generally agree that human emotions correspond to the execution of a number of computations by the central nervous system. Our previous research, as that of many other people, have studied the hypothesis that these computations yield visually identifiable facial muscle movements. However, the expression of emotion, when I internally experience an emotion, I also corresponds to a number of, or an execution, excuse me, of a number of computations that release hormones, or what's more generally known as peptides. Hormones is just a very specific type of peptides. So things like cortisol, testosterone, etc. What happens is that these peptides change not only the blood flow, but the blood composition. And most interestingly, the face is innervated with this huge number of blood vessels that are extremely close to the surface of the skin. Actually, if you look in the mirror very closely, you're actually going to see some of them popping out because they're that close to the skin. So the hypothesis that we have is that because when we internally experience emotion, we actually releasing a lot of peptides, that this blood flow and blood composition change are actually visible on the surface of the face as a facial color change because of all these large number of blood vessels on the surface of the skin. So again, just to reiterate, the hypothesis here for happiness, surprise, and compound emotions like subtly fearful is not that you have a specific number of action units, active or not active, but rather that you have a unique set of colors that only occur in happiness, consistently occur in happiness, but do not occur in the other emotion categories. So to test this hypothesis and build computer vision systems that can do recognition of emotion from these facial color changes, we ran the following experiment, which you can find in PNAS as well, PNAS that we published in 2018. So basically, what we first did is we took a large number of faces expressing certain emotions, and we described them in what's called the isoluminant color space. For those of you that do not remember or do not know what an isoluminant color space, I'm going to do a very, very, very quick review here. So consider that we have a pixel, just one pixel, in RGB. So a pixel can be described as a vector of RG and V values, right? So this pixel describes both color and luminance. Luminance is what you see right here. So what defines the shading of the object, right? So you're very aware of shade from shading. For example, this is you use the luminance information of the object to extract the three-dimensional structure of the object. And that's thanks to the shading that is a function of the shape of the object and the position of the light with respect to the object. Isoluminant color are the two dimensions. Oh, I'm sorry. Just luminance is actually computed as a linear combination of RG and V, correct? So if you go into your favorite programming tool, you can just convert an image, a color image, into a grayscale. And what that function does, it just does a linear combination of RGB, right? So for example, we could just do C1R plus C2G plus C3B, right? And then, or just take a basic average of the three, if you will, and get an average luminance, and that's just the luminance variable. Now, the isoluminant color space, isoluminant means without luminance. So by definition, the other two dimensions of this three-dimensional vector actually define the color dimensions. And hence, color, it's two-dimensional, not three-dimensional, right? Color, it's just two-dimensional, at least isoluminant color is. So let me show you in a picture what this really means. So if I start with this face of this person here, and I first compute luminance, meaning I extract an average of the RGB values, this is the luminance variable that I obtain. Now, if I extract the two-dimensional orthogonal dimensions or the two-dimensional orthogonal, excuse me, to this luminance space, then I get the two color dimensions, right? And here are the two color dimensions. These dimensions tend to look really weird because we're not used to seeing that, but this is what we really mean by color, these two dimensions here. So if I now convert these three images to grayscale using the function that I alluded to, right? You can just convert these three images to grayscale. What's going to happen? Well, with the first one, nothing's going to happen. It's going to stay the same because it's already in grayscale. But these two are going to become completely blank. And why do they become blank? Because they don't have any luminance. The luminance on each pixel in that image is exactly the same. So hence, you don't see any shading in that image, right? The only information that these two channels carry is information of color. So what we want is to demonstrate that this color information, these two channels of just color, no luminance, no shading information, actually carry information of emotion. And what we did using computer vision algorithms that we've defined over the years, we detect the face, we detect a certain number of landmarks, a huge number of landmarks on the face, and we create this tessellation of areas on the face completely automatically. And then each of these areas, from each of these areas, we extract some statistics of these two color channels, right? So for example, you can compute the mean and the standard deviation, right, of each of the pixels in that region for this channel and then for this other channel, and that gives you a feature vector, the color feature vector that we can compute. And then we're just going to use a very simple linear approach, like linear discriminant analysis or something like that, right? In our case, it was LDA, but any simple linear method is fine, just to make sure that we don't overfit to the data to see whether these color statistics, again, just from color, no shading at all, can do recognition of emotion. And the answer is yes. And here's the p-value, 10 to the minus 50, which is beyond statistically significant. The answer is that just by looking at these color changes on the face, when the face fluctuates in color because of these peptides that our body's releasing because of the emotions that we're experiencing, that we can do this recognition. So basically, that computational model of what we have implemented in the brain that I was alluding to earlier, not only has dimensions that correspond to the facial muscle articulations, but we have shown in this PNAS paper that it also has dimensions of color, right? So depending on which quadrant you are, depending on which colors, isoluminant colors you see on the image, you're actually interpreting an emotion or another, right? And we've all experienced this when people give us a really fake smile and we know it's fake, and it's because the colors, are not consistent with this. We're not conscious about this, with our brain is and actually knows how to recognize these things. So then a year later in 2019, we published this PAMI paper where we extended this to the recognition of, or we applied this rather to the recognition of action units. So basically what we did from these tessellations of the face that I've mentioned, we extract these color statistics, but in a functional way, right? So over time, over the video sequence, you extract color statistics for different channels of the color, and then you define templates of these functions that correspond to specific action units. And because the colors are going to correlate with the action units, because they are in theory correlated to one another, then you can do the recognition of the not only emotion categories, but also of the action units. And I'm going to spare you from all the details, but long story short, if you look at the results, when you combine in this paper the results of action unit classification based on the methods that I was alluding to early on from EmotionEd, where we only use convolutions on the image, on the shading of the image, and now you combine this with the color channels that I have described here, then the recognition, the accuracy, and the F1 score, this is actually F1 score, actually improves significantly. So the next thing I wanted to talk about to complicate things a little bit more is the biological motion. So I've talked about facial biological motion, the action units. I have talked about the color on the face, but now I want to go to the body, and I'm going to treat first the body just as a single entity, just like a dot, right? And my interest is to know whether something occurs because there is an agent that's behaving intentionally or an agent that's behaving non-intentionally. Maybe it's just mechanical motion. So let me show you two videos. I want you to pay close attention to these two videos and determine whether the agent in that video is doing an intention, or whether I have an agent in the video or not, rather, right? If I have an animate object that's just moving because there's mechanical motion, or if there's actually an agent that's behaving. So here you see there's a ball and there's a platform that rotates, and the platform is just pushing the ball around. So there is no intent, it's just pure mechanical motion. There is no agent performing any specific task. And now let me show you this other example. Here, as you can see, now all of a sudden, there is an agent who is actually acting intentionally. And the intent is to precisely avoid the platform, to be hit by the platform, right? And why can we do that recognition? Well, we humans can do that recognition very simply because we have a knowledge that we have acquired, which is that the total amount of energy in a closed system can never change, right? So I can have mechanical energy, I can have kinetic energy, but the sum of the two, one can be transformed into the other, but the sum of the two has to stay constant. There's no ways I can add energy into that system. However, when I have a motion like this, right, an intentional action, there appears to be an increase on the total energy. And that's because there's a non-observable chemical energy stored in that agent that is being burned somehow to actually perform this task, like jumping or moving around. Well, this is non-observable, so there is an appearance that the amount of energy that is being generated, or total amount of energy that is in that system, is actually increasing, right? So we've designed computer vision algorithms, machine learning algorithms, to actually detect that there is an increase in total amount of energy. This was just published this year in IJCV. And you don't need even any training data, right? You can just do unsupervised visual recognition of intentional actions like this. So the reason this is pretty cool is because now we can apply it to real videos like this, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of videos, and one has an intentional action only. The other one has a non-intentional action. So let's look at the first one. Here goes the first video. It's a guy shooting a ball goes in, another guy running, nothing is special. Everything is intentional in that video. But how about the second one? This, if you remember the ice bucket challenge a few years ago, this guy is going to, whoops, okay. So you can very easily detect when there is an action that is performed by the guy behind the, with the blue t-shirt, right? That's actually performing a task that is non-intentional, very clearly. Well, we can apply this algorithm that I just described to actually detect when these things happen, right? And in the IJCV paper, we have a number of examples where we show people like what I just shown, or person is skating, and at which point, shown here in red, right, the person actually is performing an action non-intentionally, right? So now we can detect the intent and non-intent from these different videos, from these different components of the video. So going back to my computational model that I keep modifying, right? For emotions, we've shown that we have action unit recognition, which is biological motion on the face. We also have color changes on the face, which are important. And I've now shown that there are actions that, or specific properties of the action that I can extract using computer vision that detects the intent of that action. There is one more context. I don't have time to cover it here, unfortunately, because the time that I'm given, but you can also look at the paper I published, a short paper in PNAS in 2019, where I detail these things a little bit further. So the last thing I wanted to mention very briefly is mentalizing. And I said from the very beginning that part of theory of mind is actually mentalizing, the ability for me to run internal movies of what might have happened or what may happen. And this is a pretty important task that we humans perform and computers are still not able to do. So here's a paper back from 2018 in ECCB called Ganimation, where we actually show that given a face, this is just the first row, it's the face, the same face repeated over and over and over again, that given that face, we can actually design generative models that can edit the action units, right, the AUs that I've mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, to simulate that action unit 1 is active, right? So this is not active in the beginning, and then you can see here action unit 1, the inner corner razor of the brows, that eyebrows are going up, up to the maximum. The outer brow corner razor, AU2, AU12, which is the classical smile, right? The pulling of the lips, AU25, which is mouth open, and so on. So now I can do simulations. This is a real image, and all these are fake images or synthetic images that I've generated by applying this algorithm, where I can actually apply, say, action unit 12 and 25 to create this, classical open mouth smile. More recently, we have actually designed another method which represents this action units. Well, this was the same here. These action units are represented in some latent space, but now we're going to represent actions that are more complex into latent space, like intent and non-intent that I showed from these videos with the balls moving, right? Either intentionally or non-intentionally. So I have a generative theory of my model now that from a latent space is able to simulate some action, some video of an action, right? And my generator is able to generate the environment and the action itself to generate what would be intentional actions or what would be non-intentional actions here. So let me show you some examples of how this model, or what some examples of what this model generates. So these are some mentalizations of the model of intent. So this is what the model has learned to generate that it considers to be intentional actions. So this is an intentional action, or the model considers this to be something that can only be done intentionally. This is the second one, and a third one, and two more. So this is my fourth example. And you can see they're all clearly intentional actions, right? Only an agent would be able to perform that. And I'll compare this with what the model considers to be a non-intentional action. So this is number one. As you can see, just a ball falling and rolling. Number two, again, just moving mechanically with absolutely no intent. Number three, same thing, just bouncing around. And number four, just bouncing on walls, moving according to the motion, the Newtonian physics that we all have learned. We are also extending this to the recognition of intent and non-intent in videos. So one ability that we humans have is that you can actually, when we observe an action, we can actually internally run that movie and determine, is that an action that I can perform intentionally or not, especially for complex actions, right, or tasks. So we can do that. We observe a video, and then from that video, what we do is we recover the latent variable representation that's closest to that video, and then we regenerate the video, and then we see whether that video that we regenerate with the model of intent actually fits the original video better than the model generated down here from non-intentional actions, right? And then that is going to allow us to determine whether it makes sense for this to fit into an intentional, non-intentional model. But other than that, we can extend this also to, or we are extending this to other, to the generation of other videos that are more complex, not just balls moving around. Here are some examples with human bodies that we are applying this to. So I've shown you that we can apply some of these things to the face to generate facial expressions, moving specific action units. Here is for the other articulations in the body. So this is actions that the model considers to be done intentionally, just walking around, fighting, dancing, and maybe petting a dog or an animal. And this to be compared with actions that are performed by the model that are non-intentional. So things like falling forward, just tripping, falling down, and falling backwards. All right, with this, I'm just going to close it for today. I really appreciate your time. If you have any questions, I'm here at the conference, so don't hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to discuss these things further. I want to thank my students. It's a privilege to be here talking about these projects, but as you know, this work was not done by me, it was mostly done by my students. So I want to acknowledge them. Here are most of them, and here are some of the past students that have also worked on these projects. And I want to give special thanks also to our funders, especially NIH, who's been funding us for years now, and also some funding that we've gotten from the HFSP, NSF, and NBI. Thanks.